Hi everybody, Dr. Flamand here, and welcome to our last lecture of TOC1b. So today you're going to have a special two-part lecture followed by a couple of videos. So the kind of itinerary for today that I want you to follow is to first watch the first part of the lecture, this part, in which I'll discuss contemporary transgender issues in U.S. American society. In the second part, Dr. Martinez will give you a quick rundown of Hawaiian history. And in the third step, we're going to ask you to view the short documentary, A Place in the Middle. If you find that you're interested in exploring issues of trans vulnerability and trans visibility further, I also have two recommended viewings for you. The first is the recent Netflix documentary Disclosure, and the second is the 1990 documentary Paris is Burning. Both of the links are up on Nestor, and you can view them in your free time, perhaps over the exam period or over the holiday break. Okay, so today I want to begin with a bit of close reading with a focus on a medium which has been especially influential in negotiating the politics of gender in American history, and that's simply magazine covers, right? So in the summer of 2014, Time magazine ran a feature article proclaiming the, quote, transgender tipping point, complete with a cover featuring transgender actress Laverne Cox, who you see here, known for her role as a transgender inmate in the popular Netflix series Orange is the New Black. The article, written by Katie Steinmetz, opens by proclaiming the transgender movement the next civil rights frontier in the wake of the 2013 Supreme Court ruling in United States versus Windsor, which invalidated Section 3 of the 1996 Defense of Marriage Act, thereby requiring federal recognition for same-sex marriages. The decision was a step towards the Supreme Court's eventual 2015 ruling in Obergefell versus Hodges, which compelled all states to perform and recognize same-sex marriages. What I'm interested in here is not only the timing of the article, the way it speaks to a particular historical moment as a kind of tipping point, but also the narrative in which it embeds that moment. It reflects, I think, a distinctly gradualistic logic in which it is somehow considered common sense that rights be distributed first to the most obvious groups before less visible ones, which I think we would all do well to challenge. The logic not only implicitly reaffirms marriage as the pinnacle of romantic sexual relationships, but also suggests marriage equality somehow fulfills or completes the gay liberation movement, a kind of assumption that I think is dubious to say the least. Perhaps most concerning is the way in which it dolls out rights in a kind of next in line fashion based upon a perceived likelihood of acceptance, so that cisgender or gender conforming gays and lesbians who wish to be in committed monogamous relationships and are thus deemed respectable should come first. And only afterwards should we turn our attention to less conventional lifestyles or less visible identities. The rhetorical effect, I think, is to place transgender people in the proverbial back seats of the civil rights bus. To complicate matters further, this logic also deploys a familiar trope, that of the Western frontier. Those of you who paid attention in their America's lectures know that the trope of the Western frontier has been considered a consolidating feature of American national destiny for some time. It is most commonly associated with Frederick Jackson Turner, who celebrated the frontier as formative of the American character, quote unquote, over the course of the 19th century, especially with regards to the American West. Conquering the frontier has also been closely associated with the concept of manifest destiny, which, as you by now know, has been used to legitimize everything from Indian removal to slavery to imperialistic expansion. Indeed, in different ways throughout American history, this frontier trope has structured policy objectives, political struggles, cultural imaginaries, and lived experiences in multiple ways. What I find interesting in its application here are the implications of framing an ostensible transgender tipping point within a narrative which treats civil rights as a kind of frontier. The effect, I think, is to create the sense that the lives, and as we will see, the bodies of transgender people come to represent some kind of terra incognita, which is to say, a land unknown or as yet undiscovered, which needs to be explored, charted, and finally assimilated into the normal routines of American life. In comparison, The January 2017 issue of National Geographic used a very different language, both visual and verbal. The magazine made a very big splash when the cover of the Transgender Revolution quote-unquote special issue it delivered to subscribers featured a picture of 9-year-old transgender girl Avery Jackson. If the language of the civil rights frontier incorporates transgender people into a narrative of exploration, gradual expansion, and eventual assimilation, the language of a gender revolution suggests something much more immediate and politically radical. It suggests a kind of out of the closet into the streets ethos associated with the early days of the gay liberation movement. I worry, however, that this rhetoric of revolution may also reinforce misperceptions about gender nonconforming and transgender people, namely that they are somehow unprecedented, new in the world, or even artificial. Moreover, insofar as sexual and gender minorities have often been accused of undermining quote-unquote American values and harboring pro-Soviet or communist sentiments, right? I worry that this rhetoric may trigger a kind of Cold War containment mentality, which conflates sexual minorities with national security threats. After all, and as those of you in the Americas 1 this semester have no doubt realized, the foreign policy of containment abroad has often been mirrored by sort of domestic containment culture at home, which sought to keep racial minorities in their place and sexual minorities in the closet. To the credit of National Geographic, however, the issue does try to present transgender issues with sensitivity. Indeed, true to its anthropological spin on popular journalism, the issue acknowledges that gender nonconforming roles and practices are in fact nothing new at all, but rather have a deep and diverse cultural history which have played out in different ways throughout the world. For those of you who took TOC1a, this should not be a surprise. There is, after all, nothing essential or innate about gender. This is not to say that gender is not real, to say that it is a social reality is, after all, to indicate the very real material and cultural consequences it has in ordering our world and our lives, and sometimes also our life chances. But that it is also in constant flux. Gender is so deeply ingrained in our everyday perceptions and habitual ways of ordering the world that people often mistake it for a universal, timeless, transhistorical constant, or else conflate it with other terms such as sex, which marks a medical or biological difference, or sexual preference, which marks the orientation of our desires towards certain objects of desire. But even sexual preference is by no means something obvious or predetermined. Although the sexual makeup of male and female bodies may fulfill slightly different roles in terms of the biological imperative, as it's called, to reproduce, sexual practices and proclivities are, as a matter of sheer empirical observation, very diverse, as are preferences in terms of the objects of sexual or romantic desire. Sexuality, it is said, exists along a spectrum. Whether the spectrum is more the product of nature or nurture or something in between or a combination of both is completely immaterial to that fact. Indeed, given the degree to which human nature is precisely kind of encapsulated in our ability to mold our own environments and adapt our own cultural codes to changing circumstances, this kind of nature-nurture distinction is probably impossible to completely disentangle anyway. Gender, of course, is not the same as sexuality. Gender, instead, is much more a matter of social and cultural conventions, although those conventions, again, can have real material consequences. Gender often seems natural simply because gender permeates nearly all of our social arrangements. Virtually no one arrives in the world free of gender. You are assigned one, after all, the moment you were born, and sometimes even earlier, right? Think about gender reveal parties, for example. Therefore, everybody eventually finds themselves oriented in relation to certain gender identities and roles, much the same way as they may find themselves oriented towards some objects of desire over others. Sometimes these orientations are imposed from the outside, other times they are felt on the inside, and again, I think the lines between the two often become very blurry indeed. In contemporary Western cultures, a large part of how we learn gender is through patterns of consumption. A stroll through the aisles of any clothing or toy store will make evident that almost all commercial products are produced and marketed according to prescribed binary gender codes. Yet there is no inherent reason why sparkly dresses or the color pink should be worn by girls and not boys. Indeed, as recently as the 1930s, blue was considered a girl's color, and pink was considered a boy's color, in the United States at least. And it wasn't until the 1940s that American manufacturers began mass producing boys' and girls' clothes, toys, and other things according to a coded blue and pink binary. Gender, in this sense, is deeply entangled with the operations of consumer capitalism. So if the things we wear, purchase, or the ways in which we behave are all, in a sense, contingent, that is to say, they are not determined by nature or essence, but rather arise from history, why do some people get so worked up when they see a young kid like Avery Jackson on the cover of National Geographic? Of course, none of this should be taken to mean that gender is somehow unreal. By now, you should have realized that although cultural assumptions, practices, and roles are historically contingent, arbitrary, greatly variable, changing over time and place, they can, as I keep reiterating, have very real and at times, unfortunately, deadly consequences. After all, when people fail to identify with the cultural roles imposed on them, some people are liable to react to the shock of that with violence. And although many human cultures in history have accepted gender nonconforming people and have even crafted roles for them in various societies, others have tried to repress them. This is because repressing gender nonconforming behavior has often been a way of naturalizing or affirming pre-existing social structures which work to the advantage of some groups over others. The result is not only to make what is purely cultural or historical appear as a simple fact of nature, but also to make complex structures of political or social dominance appear as simple and unchangeable facts of life. Invalidating, repressing, or even exterminating individuals who fail to conform to cultural conventions is a way of ensuring that nobody questions the arbitrary nature of power relations in society. In heteropatriarchal societies, where violence is often aggrandized as a sign of dominance or authority or masculine pride, this often leads to physical conflict. Not only that, it makes violence itself seem sometimes natural, especially when perpetrated by men, as if the sheer evolutionary accident that human males tend on average to be a bit larger than human females indicates some kind of divine mandate or natural prerogative, a right, so to say, over the bodies of others. Let me be very clear, no such thing exists. What I'm suggesting, however, is that violence against gender nonconforming people occurs in large part precisely because they challenge the supposed self-evidence of such ideas, of the status quo as such. Gender, ostensibly the most universal of human categories, in fact adheres not in biology, nature, or God's plan, but rather in our social structures, institutions, and hierarchies. It is therefore capable of variance and change, and if enough people realize this, it's liable to spark a revolution. In other words, what gender nonconforming behavior makes evident is the fact that our entire world could, potentially, be otherwise. Having now established these kind of theoretical considerations, I want to continue in the rest of this lecture to make the following two claims. The first is that, in large part because they are viewed as somehow unnatural, transgender people and transgender women of color in particular are among some of the most oppressed, vulnerable, and criminalized individuals in American society and elsewhere today. Second, while visibility is a crucial strategy for gaining acceptance in society, the ways in which transgender people are rendered visible, or sometimes hypervisible, in our media cultures often distracts from, ignores, or naturalizes their marginalization. Now, this is a relatively complex thesis, so I'm going to break it down into two sections. First, I'm going to discuss the intersectional vulnerabilities faced by transgender people in contemporary U.S. society, and then I'm going to turn to discuss the politics of trans visibility. Let's begin with some facts about the vulnerabilities and risks faced by transgender people in American society today. Data about transgender people remains woefully scarce, a testament to their continuing marginalization and something that sits uneasily beside their rising visibility in the field of popular culture over the past few years. The census, for example, does not collect data on transgender people. It has been estimated that about 0.5 or 1 out of every 200 people in the US identify as transgender. The number may in fact be much higher, as most trans people are afraid to report their identity. Even more people probably live with gender dysphoria, the psychological term for those who do not identify with their assigned at birth gender and hide it from others. They may hide it from others. Some research has put this number at around 2%. About half of all transgender people will be sexually assaulted at some point in their lives. Harassment, discrimination, economic marginalization, depression, suicide, and violent victimization rates are rampant amongst transgender people and are a particular problem for trans women. There are many reasons for this, but the most common issues revolve around social exclusion. Transgender people are often rejected or abandoned by family, friends, and community. This can be exacerbated, especially in smaller rural communities where trans people suffer mistreatment for standing out, and unlike in large urban communities, may have trouble finding people like themselves with whom they can socialize. Overall, existing institutions often fail to provide transgender people with basic security, safety, and health care, and that includes mental health care. Many healthcare professionals are unfamiliar with transgender issues. Therefore, trans people must often educate their own doctors regarding their own needs. Moreover, they are frequently misgendered or incorrectly treated as a result of failures to address their specific health needs or because administrative documents do not make note of their gender reassignment, right? This can be a big problem if you get the wrong treatment because of a mix-up on your administrative documents, right, about your health history or which kind of hormones you might be taking or whatever. Moreover, most health insurance providers consider surgeries, hormone treatments, or other kinds of gender-affirming procedures to be merely cosmetic and therefore offer little to no assistance in paying for them. In some cases, transgender people have trouble finding a healthcare provider at all, right? They have trouble just finding a doctor who will take care of them if they have a problem. And this can lead to transgender people feeling forced to take their health into their own hands in potentially dangerous ways. For example, some people seeking gender-affirming treatments have begun, for example, purchasing and taking hormone therapy pills on their own, right, without help from a doctor. This can have some problematic consequences if people are not careful. Transgender people are also often economically marginalized, especially when they have trouble passing as cisgender people. Even people who do manage to pass, quote unquote, often experience violence when they come out to their friends, love interests, romantic partners, or even their family. These multiple forms of rejection often deprive trans people of both emotional and financial support, which comes with family and other kinds of social ties. As a result, many become desperate. Some attempt suicide, still others fall into illicit, illegal, and often dangerous labor arrangements such as sex work. And especially due to this association with illegal sex work, transgender women are often targeted by police who consider them criminals in many cases. Many are therefore afraid or unable to seek assistance from the criminal justice system when they themselves are victimized, right? Because they're afraid that they might in turn be targeted. And as a result, transgender people who are the victims of crime often find themselves without recourse to protection or just get ignored. When their victimization is recorded, they are routinely misgendered by both law enforcement and the media. As you can imagine, transgender people often face compound risks of violent victimization, right? This is exacerbated when intersecting with race and class, as well as their geographical location and even their age. Based upon a report by the Human Rights Campaign issued a couple years back, of the 22 trans and gender nonconforming people killed in 2019 at the time of its publication, 91% were women of color, 81% were under 30, and 68% lived in the South. Locations seem to be particularly important here because of all the transgender murders which have occurred since 2013 up until 2019, 90% happened in places with a poverty rate exceeding the national average. To make matters even worse, very few states have passed laws protecting LGBTQ people of any kind, and many maintain laws which actively criminalize unconventional sexual behavior or non-conforming gender expressions. As you can see here, states with laws that actively protect or prescribe non-discrimination laws tend to be coastal areas with high population density and lots of cities. States with laws which are actively hostile to LGBTQ people tend to be in the Midwest and South, have kind of lower levels of population density, and are larger rural areas, right? Kind of the legal areas that might be included here are things like marriage and relationship recognition, right? Adoption and parenting laws. A lot of people are excluded from adoption in some places if they are not in a male-female pairing, or if they are themselves perhaps transgender, right? There's non-discrimination laws, laws protecting LGBTQ plus youth, laws about providing health and safety standards, and the ability for transgender people to correct the name and gender marker on identity documents, right? Basically to change one's identity officially. When transgender people do reach out for legal protection or assistance, they put themselves at risk of becoming the targets of, well, the criminal justice system, such as police or prosecutors. Transgender people have been historically overpoliced. This is in part because they stand out. While some pass as cis, many trans people are hypervisible, and in part because the police profile them, associating them with sex work, crime, and drugs. Indeed, one report found that 1/3 of the transgender women of color who interacted with the police were assumed to be sex workers, even when they were not. Additionally, transgender people often experience housing discrimination and thus end up living in crime-prone areas which are also already heavily policed. As a result, transgender women suffer from a higher risk of being incarcerated, with transgender women of color facing a risk 3 times that of white trans women. You can see here um, the effects of intersectional vulnerabilities at play, right? Indeed, transgender people, and transgender women in particular, are more than 4 times more likely than all US adults to have spent time in a prison or jail. This again relates to situations which contribute to their heightened levels of vulnerability and includes family rejection, subsequent homelessness, right? Unfair punishment or violent bullying at school, institutional discrimination in housing, employment, and healthcare, and finally policies which criminalize transgender people themselves, including laws which criminalize having, for example, HIV or engaging in sex work. Indeed, even such mundane activities as using public restrooms or administrative barriers such as a mismatch between gender appearance and identity documents can lead to punishment. To make matters even worse, transgender women find themselves at increased risk of sexual assault once admitted to jails and prisons. Yet again, gender intersects with race to ensure that Black, Latina, and Native American trans women are the most at risk. This often occurs because they are assigned to prisons based upon the gender they were assigned at birth, the sex indicated on their identity documents, right? Or simply based upon the appearance of their genitals. Thus, trans women often find themselves in male prisons. You can imagine which results, right? This results in what criminologists call compound punishment. These women are socially ostracized based on their gender, race, and class, and then, on top of that, they are pushed into the criminal justice system. And then, on top of that, once they're there, they might be punished even further with sexual violence. So here you can kind of see that the sexual assault rate for transgender women in jails and prisons is also a matter of kind of intersecting with race, and that transgender people in general are are victims of sexual assault at much higher rates than kind of inmates in general. Let's move on to issues of visibility. In 2018, the New York Times conducted a survey of the stock photographs which were most often used to portray transgender people. What they found was that while transgender people appear more frequently in advertisements and mass media over time, stock photos very rarely show them as full human beings. The most frequently used photos actually portray them either in very passive positions, simply standing against a wall, or else feature them covering their faces entirely, often rendering their defining features invisible. The effect is to generate the sense that transgender people exist, but only at a distance. They are not shown as full-fledged individuals with rich histories, defining facial features, and lives, but rather as stock types. What this indicates is that not only is it important that transgender people are represented in the wider culture, but also how they are represented in the wider culture. For this reason, transgender actresses and models like Laverne Cox have received special attention for their charisma, intelligence, and it must be said, their beauty, which is also to say, their ability to pass as cisgendered. Here, Cox argues that it is, quote, revolutionary, there's that word again, for any trans person to choose to be seen and visible in a world that tells us we should not exist. I certainly agree. However, it's important not only that trans people are seen, but how they are seen. That not only means that they should be depicted as full individuals for others to empathize with, but also that they need access to positive and meaningful images for themselves. We all develop our identities based in large part upon the models we have around us, and that includes transgender people, and it also includes popular culture. Here you have a quote by Alexandra Billings, which I think is telling in this regard. She says, quote, "There are more opportunities for transgender performers, but look carefully. They're very specific. We're either in the hospital, or visiting someone in the hospital, or in jail, or some kind of cage. God forbid you put us in charge of children or in the corporate world where we have power. We're having specific conversations, but it's difficult to say it's getting better." And down here at the bottom, I have just a kind of a selection of kind of popular film and television series, right, which feature gender nonconforming or transgender characters, and oftentimes those characters have been, let's say, uh, less than respectable, right? They often include, for example, in Silence of the Lambs, the character of I think it's Buffalo Bill, who is a psychopath, right? Or there's the gender nonconforming character in Boys Don't Cry, who meets a violent end, right? There's Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which is a wonderful cult classic, um, but nevertheless, I wonder sometimes the degree to which it portrays kind of transgender issues as being sometimes overly fraught, um, and sometimes glamorized in ways which might not necessarily be um, as helpful as one may think. So while the available universe of cultural resources, right, the images and the characters and the roles that they kind of have at their disposal to make sense of their lives, right? So while that universe of cultural resources is expanding, it's still relatively limited. When popular culture has depicted transgender people, it has often presented them as mentally ill, deranged, and sex crazed on the one hand, or else as emotionally or physically wounded on the other. Thus, as transgender actress Alexandra Billings argues here in the quote that I read, um, transgender characters might be getting depicted more often, but they're frequently depicted in problematic moments of crisis, right? Not kind of in their daily lives. The outlier here might be Transparent, which is this television series, although there's some fraught kind of cultural politics surrounding that too, with regards to who was chosen to play the lead in this series. So, but you can also think about, I think, popular crime shows, right? When transgender people are depicted at all in those shows, they're usually suffering from psychological delusions or criminal impulses, or else they get holed up in hospitals recovering from violent attacks. Other times they're locked up in mental institutions. Sometimes we are introduced to them as mere plot drivers, such as when they appear as nothing more than bodies left dead in a ditch. Even Laverne Cox made her name playing a transgender woman of color in prison, right? Worse yet, that character spends the majority of entire seasons locked up in solitary confinement, and we see her mentally coming apart, right? We see them very often in moments of crisis. Um, and as kind of I mentioned before with the case of Transparent, right? This is a very prestigious role, right, in a very successful television series, and some of the main parts here for transgender characters are not even played by transgender performers at all. What results from this limited realm of choice and visibility is not only a lack of exposure for transgender people, but also a lack of cultural resources from which transgender people may draw as they try to build their own identity. As a result, many transgender people relate to popular culture not through lines of identification with friends, family, or fictional characters, right? But more often through a process which queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz, um, has called disidentification. And as Munoz put it, quote, to disidentify is to read oneself and one's own life narrative in a moment, object, or subject that is not culturally coded to connect with the disidentifying subject, right, with oneself. And instead, here I quote again, disidentification is about recycling and rethinking encoded meaning. It scrambles and reconstructs the encoded message, exposes the encoded message's universalizing and exclusionary mechanisms, and recircuits its workings to account for, include, and empower minority identities and identifications. And therefore, to have one last quote, I think it's best that we think about this identification in Munoz's words as a survival strategy to resist and confound socially prescriptive patterns of identification, right? In other words, disidentification is largely about finding meaning in a culture which excludes you, right? A culture which maybe doesn't want to sustain you, but you find sustenance in it nevertheless, if I can paraphrase a very famous quote by Eve Sedgwick, right? Since American culture has historically offered almost no major roles for gender nonconforming or trans people to exist in at all, disidentification is a way for sexual and gender minorities to draw from cisgendered pop cultural icons to craft a space of one's own by reorienting their meaning to suit subcultural communal purposes. Aside from a lack of cultural scripts, many transgender people also find themselves reduced to bodies vis-a-vis the media's obsession with transition surgeries. As a result, transgender issues are often, in the popular sphere, framed through an emphasis on body parts. Transgendered bodies are often written off as somehow fake or fetishized as sexually perverse, or even stigmatized as disfigured. This in turn leads to the reduction of transgender people to mere bodies, and compromised bodies at that, which become the almost obsessive focus of public discourse. A good example of this occurred a few years back when Katie Couric, during an interview with Laverne Cox and transgender model Carmen Serrera, insisted upon asking invasive questions about their transition surgeries. Let's quickly watch and see how Cox finally responded to Katie Couric's kind of persistent questions about transition surgeries.
I think that the preoccupation with transition and with surgery objectifies trans people, and then we don't get to really deal with the real lived experiences. The reality of trans people's lives is that so often we're targets of violence. We experience discrimination disproportionately to the rest of the community. Our unemployment rate is twice the national average. If you're a trans person of color, it's 4 times the national average. The homicide rate in the LGBT community is highest amongst trans women. And when we focus on transition, we don't actually get to talk about those things. There's a young woman named Ilan Nettles who on August 17th was just walking down the street with some friends, you know, minding her own business, and she was catcalled by a couple of guys. And one of them, once they realized she was trans, she was beaten into a coma, and 5 days later she died. This is the reality of so many trans people's lives in this country, trans women of color whose lives are in danger simply for being who they are. And we're looking for justice for Ilan's murder, and we're looking for justice for so many trans people across this country. And by focusing on bodies, we don't focus on the lived realities of that oppression and that discrimination.
So this kind of obsessive focus on bodies has also caused controversy between some self-avowed feminists and transgender women. This has ranged from outright rejection of transgender women as sexual perverts masquerading as fake women to a more ambivalent response based sometimes on ignorance, sometimes on concern, sometimes on other issues, right? On the less combative side, but nevertheless, I think problematically, Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie um, stirred up controversy with the following statement a few years back as well. Quote, I think if you've lived in the world as a man with the privileges the world accords to men, and then sort of switch gender, it's difficult for me to accept that then we can equate your experience with the experience of a woman. Laverne Cox responded by pointing out, I think quite correctly, that those assigned the gender of male at birth do not all, in fact, always benefit as a result. I was a very feminine child, though I was assigned male at birth. My gender was constantly policed. I was told I acted like a girl and was bullied and shamed for that. My femininity did not make me feel privileged. I would contend that I did not enjoy male privilege prior to my transition. Patriarchy and cissexism punished my femininity and gender nonconformity. The irony of my life is that prior to transition, I was called a girl, and after, I am often called a man. Here we enter a bit into themes we discussed in prior weeks, right? As any school child learns quickly, men who fail to conform to the demands of hegemonic masculinity often find themselves not only ostracized or marginalized, but potentially at the receiving end of physical violence. Even aside from the threat of violence, men, no less than women, are constantly expected to perform contradictory roles and meet unrealistic expectations which they might, in fact, be deeply uncomfortable with merely to survive. If men and women fail to meet gender expectations, society has all kinds of ways of punishing them for it. Finally, several people have pointed out that visibility alone cannot create a safe world for transgender people. Indeed, the increase in trans visibility has unfortunately been accompanied by a documented increase in reactionary violence against transgender people. Attempts to address this violence by passing increasingly punitive laws and ramping up policing often backfire, as at-risk trans women seeking help from law enforcement often find themselves caught up in the ever-widening law enforcement dragnet instead. Thus, as David Spade has argued, quote, the logic of visibility and inclusion surrounding anti-discrimination and hate crime laws campaigns is very popular, yet there are many troubling limitations. One concern is whether these laws actually improve the life chances of those who are purportedly protected. These kinds of reforms have not eliminated bias, exclusion, and marginalization, despite changes that declare those things illegal. However, these issues often become the focus of endless political bantering, right? Distracting from the more complicated realities of transgender people's lived experience. And indeed, since gender difference permeates our institutions from bathrooms to birth certificates, there are all kinds of ways in which transgender people can find themselves marginalized, and yet people rarely consider the full spectrum of problems this creates. Or as Sean Faye puts it, um, quote, there has been a 45% rise in transphobic hate crime last year, and 2 in 5 trans people have experienced a hate crime or incident in the past year. Um, Much has changed for the better, but the visibility the media provides often sees us endlessly talking about the same things. Hence the interminable discussion of toilets and changing rooms, which are more about cisgender people's fears than transgender people's lives. To close this first part of the lecture, and before you turn to the second part from Dr. Martinez, I want to suggest that while important, visibility alone cannot address systemic discrimination. That's even more so if this increased visibility is based only around particularly successful and frankly good-looking transgender people, women and men. Indeed, I worry that a focus on visibility risk normalizing certain kinds of exceptionally beautiful transgender people who could otherwise pass as cisgender, while leaving less fortunate people in terms of looks, or maybe people earlier on in their transitions, right? Or maybe those who did not transition at young enough age to get the full effects. That it kind of leaves those less fortunate people along the wayside, right? If we only focus on exceptional people. A gay rights agenda which focuses almost exclusively on marriage equality risks trading respectability and normality for certain acceptable classes of queer people, right? Especially kind of cisgender or gender conforming gays or lesbians, at the expense of less quote unquote acceptable others, right? Of deviant others, to put that in scare quotes. Similarly, a transgender movement focused solely on visibility risks elevating the status of certain trans people, right? Namely, the kinds who find a sympathetic or even adoring eye amongst mainstream audiences, or those who already enjoy a substantial degree of, um, for example, class privilege, right? Or wealth, or are insulated in some way from all the problems that those who are much less fortunate must face, right? So I'm worried that a transgender movement which is only about visibility really fails to help those most at risk, right? And thus I concur with Laverne Cox in this quote here that the transgender movement, in fact, social movements in general, need to be understood within the context of a broader intersectional focus on social justice for all, right? As Emma Lazarus is credited with having said, quote, "Until we are all free, none of us are free," end quote. And as I think we will see in the next part of the lecture with Dr. Martinez, this applies not only to race, gender, and sexual orientation, but also within the context of Western colonialism and American imperial expansion as well. So for the next steps, what I want you to do is please have a listen to Dr. Martinez's short lecture on Hawaiian history. Then have a look at the short video Place in the Middle by PBS Hawaii. And while you're watching that video, I want you to ask yourself a couple questions, right? I want you to ask yourself, what does the historical erasure of third gender people like the Mahu indicate about the colonial repression of indigenous cultures, right? What can it tell us, in other words, about colonialism and post-colonialism, two topics that came up last week in your lecture? And what does this history in turn imply about contemporary transgender identities, right? How should we understand them, and how should we understand their history? Yeah. Thanks for that. Enjoy watching the rest of the material for this week, and enjoy, please, and I hope that you also enjoy the book that you read for this week, and I'm looking forward to discussing these things with you in the seminar. Thanks. Have a good rest of the week.